Well, you'll be able to tell from the handout that I don't subscribe to the narrative theory that Frege uses, where you only say everything once. I'm of the journalistic school. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. If it's a complicated story, I think that works better. That's on a dimension orthogonal to the mystery story organization of a philosophical tale that Frege uses here, which is to set up a puzzle, to say what the criteria of adequacy on a solution of it are, to give your answer, and to show why that's the solution, or anyway better than the other solutions. That, I think, is a fine way to organize a philosophical essay, independent of whether you're, but if you do that, you can't tell them what you're going to tell them in advance. So it is a different structure. But I wanted to start with a recap, just so we're on the same page after a week ago. There's something paradoxical about counting. What is it that you're counting? If you say, well, what you count, the answer to how many questions is things, objects, particulars, items, units. The trouble is you can't count any of those things. You can't say how many items are on the table. You can't say that because you get contradictory answers. I hold this up and ask how many. Well, it's one book. It's many chapters. There's more pages than that. There's more characters in it than that. Which am I talking about? And Frege's answer seems like it's got to be the right answer. Is, well, concepts. There's a missing variable there, a missing relativity to a concept. If I ask you how many pages there are, pages are countable in a way that objects aren't. Embarrassingly, countable is one of these pseudo-sortals, one of these placeholders for a sortal. You can't count countables. There's something paradoxical about that, but you can count anything countable, but countables aren't among the things that you can count that way. So one might quibble with his specification of what you need to specify as a concept, but think of that as a black box. He's going to call it a concept. Now he's going to have to give us an account of what concepts are that makes that work. Now, not all concepts do it. That is, provide the missing argument place so that you can count things. Only concepts that, as he says, isolate what falls under them in a definite way. Well, which are those concepts? They're not. They're not merely attributive concepts. They're not what would be expressed by adjectives that characterize, classify, or describe what they apply to. It's not concepts like green or large or fragile. What we want is not adjectives, but actually a kind of noun. We want kind terms, common nouns, we could call them. Those are expressions that say what kind of thing something is. But not all kind terms isolate what falls under them in a definite manner. There are mass kind terms, like water or gold, that don't. At least they don't unless you supply yet a further argument place and say, well, I'm talking about buckets of water or pounds of water or something like that. I'm going to put the mass kind terms, which are a kind of noun, I'm going to put them to one side. The other kind of kind term is sortal kind terms. I think sortal kinds and mass kind terms, I think that's Quine's terminology in word and object. So we can label at least the concepts that isolate what falls under them in a definite way as sortal kind terms. But what substantively can we say about them that isn't just a label of them? Well, and again, I'm helping myself to Quine's useful articulation of this. All the concepts have criteria of application. They share that with adjectives. Green does, gold does, cat does. They're properties that something needs to have in order to have those things apply to it. And sortal kind terms like dog also have criteria of application. I talked last time about how I think you should look at criteria about consequences of application as well. Put that to one side, just focus upstream. Sortal kind concepts are distinguished by also having criteria of identity and individuation. In order to answer how many questions, to be able to count, you have to be able to tell K's, K is the kind term, you have to be able to tell K's apart. You have to be able to answer the question, is this the same K as that? Otherwise, you can't count them. You might be counting the same one twice if you can't tell them apart. Frege says, you have to give a sense to recognition judgments, judgments that express the recognition of an object as the same again, when it's given in two different ways, at two different times, two different demonstrations, a description, an object. You may already be able to describe someone as the murderer, but if you can't also describe him as Jones, if you can't recognize the murderer again when given in another way, you don't know what object you're talking about. A singular term, apart from any identities that it's involved in, is the sound of one hand clapping. You need two of them. They're like arrows, and unless you have two of them, you haven't succeeded in picking out an object. So he says, what we need are recognition judgments, and further claim, recognition judgments are identity claims. Claims of the form A is B in the sense of is that expresses identity. We have to say that because we can also use an is of attribution. I can say that the apple is red. That's not asserting an identity claim. That's merely an attribution, a predication. But the is of identity, it's flanked by singular terms. He says in 76, to use the symbol equals, or identity, is to designate something an object, the thing that's picked out by the two terms that flank the identity. So he says, what we have to do is specify the conceptual content of an identity judgment, which is the form of recognition judgments. We have to specify its conceptual content. Now we know from section 3 of Begriffsschrift what conceptual contents are. At any rate, we know that if two things have the same conceptual content, you can substitute one for the other as premises of an implication, salva consequentiae. That is, without changing any of the consequences of it, substituting one for the other as a premise never turns a good implication into a bad implication. That's the criterion of identity and individuation for conceptual contents. We'll see later on he's specifying them by abstraction, but that's a point for later on. But now we ask, so what is the conceptual content of recognition judgments, that is, identity judgments? What's the inferential role that's characteristic of an identity claim that contains two singular terms flanking an identity claim? And he says, and this is a further claim that he's making, a further thesis that he has, it's an intersubstitution license. The content of it, the inferential significance of that, if you add it as a premise, it's saying that substituting A for B or B for A in the premises of inferences will never turn a good implication into a bad one. That is, you can substitute one term for the other, salva consequentiae, even though the singular terms themselves can't play the role of premises in an implication. They don't by themselves have a directly inferential role. They can't be premises or conclusions of implications. If Coda is the name of my dog, you can't just say Coda as a premise in some implication. But he's extending the notion of conceptual content from things that can be premises and conclusions of implications, what's expressed, I want to say by definition, by declarative sentences. That is, I think that's a definition of declarative sentence, is what can play the role both of premise and conclusion of implication relations. I throw in incompatibility relations as well, but never mind about that. His method of noting inferential invariances under substitution applies in the first instance to premises and conclusions of implications, but if we have an expression like an identity expression that has these two subsentential expressions flanking an identity sign, we can take it now to license intersubstitutions of those same expressions as they occur in premises and conclusions of implications, and the conceptual content, the inferential role of that's characteristic and defining of identity statements is as an intersubstitution license. When you add that as a premise, it follows from that not just what the conclusions were of the premise that you had before, but also all the implications that you can get by substituting B's for all the A's or A's for all the B's. Parenthetically, you can screw things up if it isn't uniform substitution. If you just substitute some A's for some B's. This caused Russell and Whitehead fits in Principia, and they didn't actually get their substitution rules right. It took people, in the next 6 or 7 years to actually get the substitution rules right for Principia, because they didn't fully appreciate the importance of uniform substitution. Now, Frege's official topic in the Grundlagen is the concept number, but giving the answer to the question, what are numbers, their answers to how many questions, that ties them to counting, because that's how you answer how many questions, drives him to think very generally about what objects are. They're what you get a semantic grip on by asserting identities, because the identities express recognition judgments, express recognition of them as the same again, which is what you need for counting, which is what you need for answering how many questions. Further, we see that there's an intimate connection between the singular terms, the ones that in Quine's phrase purport to refer to one and only one object. Quine immediately says, talk of purport is a colorful metaphor for a basically grammatical point. And Frege is telling us what the grammatical point is. The point purporting to refer to an object is being suitable to flank some true identity claims. But we see there's an intimate connection between singular terms in that sense, which pick out objects, and certain kinds of concepts, sortal kind concepts. So Frege needs to investigate the notion of object and the notion of concept to, for instance, distinguish kind concepts from merely attributive concepts, distinguishing the different kinds of kind concepts, the mass kind concepts and the sortal kind concepts. A lot of this is only implicit in what Frege tells us in the Grundlage, but it is genuinely implicit. You can see him making all the distinctions that are needed here. So we need to think in general about sortal concepts and objects and the relations between concepts and objects. This is what I think is philosophically most important about this book, not the actual definition of number that he gives, which, as I'll mention later on, Crispin Wright and other people have shown that from what he says you can derive the Peano axioms for arithmetic. So he's giving us an adequate concept of number. That's important, but it's not what's philosophically most central. Why not? Because objects and concepts are much more generally important than numbers are. Thinking about numbers is a good way in to that more general philosophical topic. Okay, that's telling you what I found in the text last time. I hope that sounds familiar and compelling. He's making a number of steps here, but each one of them seems to me convincing. It's cutting at the joints. It's making important distinctions. Yeah, that's the stuff we got to get clear about, is sortal kind concepts, singular terms, and identities. Those are all tied up. We're not going to understand one of them without understanding the others. That's the basic phenomenon that Geach focuses on when he says, I don't understand wide open quantifiers that are supposed to quantify over everything. And you say, well, what do you mean by thing? And there's an argument place missing. We need sortals in there. I mean every person in this room, not every thing in this room, or every occupied spatiotemporal region, or something like that. That's going from a mass noun. I made a few preliminary remarks trying to map this conceptual structure onto some issues in the history of philosophy, particularly focusing on the notion of substance and substance talk. And pointed out that this involves a criticism of classic quantificational logic as we get it from Principia Mathematica, which doesn't have sortals or kind terms in it at all, and the Tarskian model theory that is a natural semantics for that. Natural not in the sense it should have been obvious, but once Tarski gave it to us, we could see why how that could match perfectly what quantificational logic was doing, but it just invokes a domain of things, no sortals involved, or if there are, we don't talk about them. We push them off stage into some semantic metavocabulary that's sufficiently expressively powerful to actually individuate the things that are in the domain. So now I want to think a little bit harder about the relation between sortal concepts and things of different kinds and identity claims. Seller's favorite phrase for pushing harder in this is, let's beat about in the neighboring bushes. And the picture is you're sort of hunting for some small animal that if you get close enough to it will run and somebody can shoot it, and you're looking to see whether if you beat about in these bushes whether anything runs out that's worthwhile. So for the first sort of new point, I want to distinguish three kinds of identity claims. Identity claims, an identity symbol, which we flanked by two singular terms. We understand the significance of the identity symbol as an intersubstitution license, salva consequentiae, of the two things that are flanking it. One of our questions is going to be, well, intersubstitutable in which contexts? Because different identity claims seem to license different ones. And Frege several times in the Grundlagen says, well, you've got to settle the truth values of all the identity claims in order to properly introduce a singular term. That turns out to probably be an overreach, but if it is, we need to know why and what fallback positions are possible. So, as we get to the least problematic identity claims, are intrasortal identity claims, where, say, we're talking about persons. And when I say that, that's where we get the criteria of identity and individuation. And then we can form definite descriptions from them. The inventor of bifocals, the first postmaster general, they both are Ben Franklin, so we can throw him in if we like, but all of them are persons. And when you say the inventor of bifocals is the first postmaster general, you're saying they are the same person. You're expressing a recognition judgment of a person as the same again. And there's no problem saying that Ben Franklin is both the inventor of bifocals and the first postmaster general, even though he, that person, Ben Franklin, might not have invented bifocals, but he still would have been that person. And he might not have been the postmaster general, but it still would have been the same person. That's a crucial part of the intelligibility of that identity claim, that there's a sortal there that's governing the recognition of objects as the same again. It's giving us the criteria of identity and individuation. Now, those are not the only identities, though. It's not the only kind. You can have identities that have different sortals on the two sides of the identity claim. The first class I want to talk about, I'll call weakly cross-sortal identity claims. Cross-sortal because there's different sortals governing the terms flanking the identity claim. But if those sortals are related to each other in the right way, you can still have good identity claims. So Pedro the donkey is the only mammal in the stable. Well, we've got donkey as the sortal for the one term, and mammal as the sortal for the other term. Those are different sortals. You can tell because not all mammals are donkeys, so they're different. To be a donkey, you have to satisfy, you have to have different properties than you have to be a mammal, in that you have to have properties to be a donkey that not all mammals have. So they're cross-sortal, but they're what I'll call Linnaean. That's after Linnaeus, Carlos Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy. In a way, it's silly to pin this on him because Plato and Aristotle talked about genus and species as well. But Linnaeus they also had a lot of collateral claims about this, as the medievals did. Linnaeus just wanted to classify things. He's a particularly pure form. He says, well, we divide things into animals, plants, and minerals, and among the animals, we divide them into the mammals, the reptiles, the fish. We had 5 or 6 categories of them, the arthropods. Worms were a special group. And then within them, within the mammals, donkeys are going to be in there somewhere. The crucial thing about these Linnaean structures of sortals is that you can reason down. The fundamental criteria of identity and individuation of donkeys are the criteria of identity and individuation of mammals, in the specific sense that if you've got A and B and they're both donkeys and they're the same mammal, then they're the same donkey. Now you could have A and B who were both mammals and weren't donkeys. They wouldn't be the same donkey because they're not donkeys. But if A and B are both donkeys, so they are both mammals. If they're the same mammal, then they're the same donkey. That's characteristic of what I'm calling Linnaean identities, really, or relations of sortals, structures of sortals. And this donkey and the only mammal in the stable, they can be the same mammal, the same donkey in that case. That even though the donkey might not have been in the stable and still would have been the same donkey, but it still would have been the same mammal too if it weren't in there. And that means that the subjunctive properties, the modal properties of it, are the same as they need to be for intersubstitution to be salva consequentiae. The Linnaean structures, those are cross-sortal identities, but they have the same nice properties that intrasortal, same-sortal identities have. Now, Geach thinks that there can be true identities involving what I'm going to call strongly cross-sortal identities, ones where the sortals are not related to each other in a Linnaean way. And here, the most famous example is Goliath and Lumpel. This is from Alan Gibbard's piece on contingent identities, I think in the late 70s. Goliath is a clay statue. Someone has gone to great trouble and shaped this lump of clay into the statue Goliath. It's this statue, and because he's downstream from Kripke, who's interested in how proper names interact with identities and sortals and intersubstitution differently than definite descriptions do. He says, let's name him Goliath. That's a name of the statue. But the lump of clay that it's made out of, we can identify, we can name that too, call that Lumpel. And here they are. I can point to Goliath, and I can point to Lumpel, and I'm pointing at the same thing. The one is a statue, the other is a lump of clay. Well, I'm going to treat lump of clay as a proper kind sortal, even though it's formed from the mass noun clay. That's just a small infelicity of this example. So they're not related. Those two sortals, though, statue and lump of clay, are not related in the way I'm calling Linnaean. If A and B are statues, and A is the same lump of clay as B, for them to be Linnaean, it would have to be that A and B were the same statue. But you could take Lumpel in the form of Goliath and squash him and make him into a new statue, say a statue of David. David and Goliath are different statues, even though you never see them in the same place at the same time. They're different statues, but it's the same lump of clay. So they're not Linnaean. And I want to claim, this is a strong claim, that strongly cross-sortal identities aren't true. They're not identity. Lumpel has properties that are essential to the criteria of identity and individuation, or the difference between the criteria of identity and individuation of statues and lumps of clay, that it's not destroyed by having its shape radically changed. Whereas statues, I don't want to try and write out criteria of identity and individuation for statues, but radical changes in the shape of the material the statue is made out of can destroy the statue. That's why you can be an iconoclast, someone who breaks the icons, the idols, the statues. You pull them down, they shatter, and they're gone. That statue is destroyed. Maybe somebody could try and get the shape back by gluing them back together. Well, then we grind them to powder. And so the claim is that if the relation between the sortals is non-Linnaean, they just have different criteria of identity and individuation without that kind of structured inheritance from the one of the criterion identity and individuation of the other, then there are always going to be properties, subjunctive properties, it's true, that the one has that the other one doesn't have, which are essential to its being the same K for one of them. So, the answer to the question whether the statue is identical to the lump of clay, the answer is no. They have an intimate relation, but even in the case where as soon as the clay is brought into existence, it's shaped as Goliath, and when we shatter Goliath, we also disintegrate the lump of clay, so there's no lump of clay. So for the entire existence of Goliath and Lumpel, they occupy exactly the same region of space. Even in that case, they're not identical. Yeah, John?
So I'm just a little bit confused. So you want to deny that the Goliath is identical to Lumpel, but you also say on the handout that the hold conditional does not hold. And I was a little bit confused because if the conditional does not hold, it means that the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. But if the antecedent is true, then we have A as a statue and A as a lump of clay. So then it seems like we can say the statue A is identical to the lump of clay A.
Good point. Being a statue and being a lump of clay are properties.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining that we can pick out the criteria of application using the is a thing. So every sortal dog, has got an associated adjective, is a dog.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I can formulate this or read this formulation in a way that isn't circular in the way you're concerned about. Let's look at some of the cases that I suggest. Consider, on the one hand, the relation between kitten and cat, and the relation between passenger and person. So a kitten is a young cat. A passenger, let's say an airline passenger, is a person traveling on an airplane. Now, I claim the relation between kitten and cat is Linnaean, so that this kitten can be identical with this cat. Not all cats are kittens. These are different sortals. Old cats are not kittens. But if A and B cats are kittens, if they both have that property of being young cats, and they're the same cat, then they're the same kitten. And it's the case that this kitten and this cat can be the same cat, as well as being the same kitten. Genuine identity under both sortals. Passenger and person are not like that. Even though you get the criteria of identity and individuation of passenger from person, the Linnaean principle doesn't hold. If A and B are both passengers, and A is the same person as B, it doesn't follow that A is the same passenger. This is a matter of the criteria of identity and individuation that say, when I fly from Pittsburgh to New York, I'm one passenger. When I fly back from New York to Pittsburgh, I'm a different passenger. This isn't something, that part isn't some nefarious plot on the part of the airlines. They want to count person segments, flight segments. That's what they mean by passengers. And because they count them that way, this Linnaean principle doesn't apply to them. It can be the case that me getting on the airplane from Pittsburgh to New York is a passenger, and I'm a person, and me getting on the plane from New York to Pittsburgh, I'm a person, I'm a passenger. So both of those terms are properly characterized as is a passenger, but the fact that I'm the same person in those two cases does not entail that I'm the same passenger. And that means that there's subjunctive properties that I have as a person that I don't have as a passenger. I would still be the same person if I hadn't taken either of those flights, but I wouldn't be that passenger. And even the passenger that got on the one flight, if I never take the return flight, just stay in New York, then that other passenger wouldn't even exist. So, qua passenger, I can be destroyed in ways, the criteria of identity can fail in ways that don't fail in the other case. Intersubstitutions are not licensed salva consequentiae if we're looking at those properties. One last example to sort of test your intuitions here, in talking about real properties and gerrymandered properties, Jerry Fodor introduces the sortal phrygion. A phrygion, as he defines it, is a photon if Jerry's refrigerator is on. The compressor that goes on at sometimes and goes off at other times. A phrygion is a photon when Jerry's fridge is on. So he says, in an instant, I hear the compressor go on, and all the photons in the universe turn into phrygions. And when I hear it, before that, there are no phrygions in the entire universe. But as soon as that goes on, the universe is full of phrygions. There's as many of them as there are photons. Well, as there were photons, because they're all phrygions now. And yet, that change, which seems like a big change, it's happening to all the photons in the universe, and suddenly the universe is full of phrygions, and then they all vanish. But it has no physical consequences. That change doesn't make any difference to anything else. Well, of course it does if you define other things in terms of whether Jerry's fridge is on, so there's more of a story to be told. Question I want to ask is, are phrygions photons? Are they related in the Linnaean way that I'm claiming is sufficient for transsortal identities to possibly be true, and necessary for cross-sortal identities to be possibly true, not conceptually ruled out? Well, is it Linnaean or is it not? The question is, if A and B are phrygions, and they're photons, they're still photons, and they're the same photon, are they the same phrygion? Right, that's the Linnaean criterion. And the truth is, Fodor doesn't say enough for us to answer that question. He doesn't say anything about how you count phrygions. That is, if I track one photon and it turns into a phrygion and then turns back into a non-phrygion and then turns into a phrygion again, same photon, is that one phrygion or is that two? If those are two phrygions, if he's counting them the way the airlines count passengers, then no phrygion is ever identical to any photon. It goes in the non-Linnaean bucket. But if he says, yeah, that's the same phrygion, then phrygion is a property that photons can acquire or lose without ceasing to exist. It's compatible with their criteria of identity and individuation, and we count phrygions by counting photons that have this special property, but that's like counting young cats, and that's okay. Okay, let me say a couple things in the vicinity here. Look, there is a really intimate relation between statues and lumps of clay. Material constitution is the identity-like relation that, anyway, the label that people have seized on. I'm thinking here, Lynn Rudder Baker is the one who's worked on this. she has a book on material constitution. I'm not sure that's the title, but you can find it. Arguing, look, we should think about that. That's in its way as important a relation as identity, but for all these reasons, it's a different relation. This is a really important line of thought for thinking about supervenience of various properties on sort of the physical constitution of the universe. Every possible case of Google stock going up $1 on the stock market is also some arrangement of subatomic particles. We can't say in the language of physics what they all have in common. And that's not a merely medical impossibility. One cannot say in the language of physics what those different constellations of subatomic particles have in common, what distinguishes them from the ones that are not instances of Google stock price going up $1 on the stock market. Dan Dennett argues this well in his essay, Real Patterns. But there's some kind of material constitution relation there. And clearly it's a conceptually important issue how we think about the relation between material constitution and identity with concepts like prices. Maybe those are broadly functional sortals. There's a collection of sortals: valve, pump, filter, pipe, and fluid. Those are functional concepts that we can apply hydraulically as originally, but it turns out we can apply them to electricity just as well. That is, saying that something is a valve or a fluid and so on. It is not specifying its physical constitution. It's saying something about how it's related to other things in that family of functional concepts. And we're interested in how sortals like that relate to the sortals of the physical constituting parts. This is a big, intricate, complex topic, and we have by no means sorted everything out here. Many philosophical questions turn out to have this form. Let me mention one philosophical area where this comes up. Quine maintained for a good academic generation that modal and intentional idioms actually are unintelligible. If you press them, they don't make sense. He had an article, he used the phrase, look, you can talk about what's possible and what's necessary and about essences and so on, but you're really just engendering an illusion of understanding. Dana Scott used that as the title for one of his modal logic papers, on engendering an illusion of understanding. He said, no, what really makes sense is just extensional things. Extensional contexts, in Quine's use, are ones where you can substitute co-referential terms salva veritate, which for him meant salva consequentiae, because good inferences preserve truth. And notoriously, you can't always do that in modal contexts. And David Lewis coming along in the wake of the 14-year-old Saul Kripke, who gave us the possible worlds semantics for quantified modal logics, says, look, think about the Quinean properties of a world, of a possible world, as the properties such that to know whether something has it in that world, you don't need to look outside that world. Whether the thing is made of copper doesn't depend on what's going on elsewhere. It's just a matter of what's true here. Whether it's shaped into a cube doesn't depend on things. Whether it's fragile, yes, that's talking about possibilities. If struck sharply, would it break? Now you're talking about possibilities. Quine says we've got to be able to do without terms that involve subjunctive assessments like that ask us to look outside the world. But, so this Lewisian line of thought goes, Kripke showed us that if we step up to the meta-language and look at the points of semantic evaluation as being these possible worlds, and understand the non-modal properties, the extensional in his sense properties that they each have, we can understand the modal properties just by quantifying over this domain. So we can say to have the property necessarily is to have it in all the possible worlds, or in all the ones that are appropriately related to this one that are accessible from it. And to say it's possible is just to say there is, just an ordinary quantification, there is a world in which this thing doesn't have the extensional property it has here, it has another one. If that's true, then it's possible in this world that it have it, even though it isn't actual. So, the picture goes, you don't have to swallow any spooky stuff, just extensional properties, and step up and quantify over these possible worlds as points of semantic evaluation. That's the Kripkean magic. It showed us how we could make subjunctive and modal properties, intensional properties in general, extensionally respectable. That would be true if there were any properties that are extensional in Quine's sense. In one sense, there is extensional insofar as that means that you can intersubstitute co-referential terms salva veritate. There are properties like that. But those are not properties such that in order to know, I mean, this is not an epistemic thing, to settle, for it to be settled, whether something has that property in one world, what's happening in other worlds is irrelevant. Because every empirical property, anyway, has subjunctive necessary conditions. It's not copper in this world if it wouldn't conduct electricity. It's not copper in this world if it wouldn't melt if you raised its temperature to 1084 degrees C. To apply that property, copper, to it is to commit yourself to all sorts of things about what would happen if. And similarly to say that it's cubical. If you were correctly to count the vertices coming, the edges coming off of each vertex, you better get 3 in each case. You would get 3 if you properly counted them. Mathematics, where subjunctive conditionals are hard to process, another case. But empirical properties, my claim is, all of them have subjunctive necessary conditions. A necessary condition is a consequence, but they're necessary conditions in that if they don't have that consequence, then you can't apply the term. So, you can't use, you ought not to use that rationale for being comfortable with subjunctive properties on Quinean grounds. There's a misunderstanding involved in it. So anyway, that's another philosophical area where thinking about the criteria of identity and individuation that go with various sortals. That's the claim I'm making. This, chunk of copper or cube of copper. Those are all richly subjunctive properties. Okay, so I mean just to have descended to a somewhat finer grain in thinking about the relation between singular terms, sortal kind terms, and identity claims. Okay. Now, think about singular terms in relation to sortal concepts and identities from a slightly different perspective. You can create singular terms from sortal concepts. You can do that by forming definite descriptions. The next human being to pass through that door, I shall call Lucky One. The next human being or person. Good question whether those are how those sortals are related, but I'm not going to go into that. If you think that they're related in a Linnaean way, you're an Aristotelian. If you think they're not, you're a Kantian, along that dimension. But Frege says the definition of an object in terms of a concept under which it falls is a different matter from what he's been talking about. For example, the expression "the largest proper fraction" has no content, since the definite article claims to refer to a definite object. The largest proper fraction, well, suppose it's n over m, then we can always form a larger one as n plus 1 over m. So there is no largest proper fraction, since the definite article, the, claims to refer to a definite object. On the other hand, the concept fraction smaller than 1, and such that no fraction smaller than 1 exceeds it in magnitude, is quite unexceptionable. In order, indeed, to prove that there exists no such fraction, we must make use of just this concept, despite its containing a contradiction. However, if we wish to use this concept for defining an object falling under it, it would, of course, be necessary first to show two distinct things: that some object falls under this concept, and that only one object falls under it. Since the first of these propositions, not to mention the second, is false, it follows that the expression "the largest proper fraction" is senseless. Now, here he's introducing the idea of a method of forming singular terms referring to objects from sortal concepts if you can satisfy these two conditions of existence and uniqueness. You have to show that there is something that falls under it, and that there's only one thing. That is, that anything else that falls under it must be identical to it. Now, I said something falls under it. but we're talking about a specific sortal concept. We've got a concept K. You've got to show that for some singular term A, K of A is true. That's the existence claim. And uniqueness, that if for any other term such that K of B, it must be that A equals B. I'm pleased to see you, lucky man. You've been baptized by the definite description of the next human being who walks through that door about 10 minutes ago. Yes, that's right. But put it on your CV. So Frege here gives criteria of adequacy for introducing definite descriptions from sortal concepts, existence and uniqueness. I want to make two initial semi-silly observations about that. First, he does that in a footnote. It was a side thing he did while he's making another point about the utility of concepts that involve contradictions, and so nothing falls under them. This is important softening up because later on he's going to define zero as the number of concepts that nothing falls under. So this is a side point. On the other hand, he has a theory of the formation of definite descriptions, of the semantics of definite descriptions here. In this footnote, essentially he has the theory that Russell elaborates in his famous article on definite descriptions, often thought of as one of the two founding articles of analytic philosophy. Really, all Russell is doing in there is putting into something like the language of Principia Mathematica what Frege has said in this footnote. Neither of those is a philosophically deep observation, but in passing, I think those are worthwhile. Uniqueness we can understand in terms of the identities relative to the sortal that we're forming the definite description from, and the identities involving them. It means that whatever singular term falls under the sortal, there's a true identity between it and the referent of the definite description, a true identity with the definite description, the K such that, on the left side, and whatever you've got on the right side. If it's true that the one on the right side is a K, then that's a true identity. That's uniqueness. You need some logical material to make that clear, but basically everything you need, we've already said in thinking about this triangular relation between singular terms, sortals, and identity claims. Existence is tougher. Existence we can do if there's some term in the old vocabulary that's already identical to the thing we're introducing. If the sortal is human being, and we think that you can individuate human beings as space-time worms, then there's going to be a specification in space-time terms of the K, the person, such that. And by finding that specification in the antecedent vocabulary, we're going to show that there is a person. Now, the relation between persons and those space-time worms, those identities, material constitution, the point is you can show it exists in the way that I can show that there is a solution to an arithmetic equation by finding a numeral, which when you plug it in, say a numeral in piano notation, and say, well, this is how many strokes you have to put after the zero in order to get, a true equation here. So this equation has a solution. There is a solution to this equation. As I said, the uniqueness, and there's only one. We sort of know how to do that. In the special case then, where what we're picking out can be specified in some other vocabulary, that's a route to satisfying the existence condition. So for spatiotemporal objects, maybe specifying the spatiotemporal region they occupy is at least a sufficient condition of individuation. But if what we're introducing is singular terms that fall under a new sortal, showing existence for those isn't going to be by the same means. And showing uniqueness is going to involve some identities in the new sortals. So these are all important as we move on to the next topic, which is not, as with definite descriptions, forming new singular terms from old sortals, but forming new sortals from old sortals. And so a whole class of new singular terms from the singular terms that fell under our old sortal. And this is an operation forming new sortals from old by abstraction that is very general and incredibly important. And nobody really knew how it worked before Frege wrote the Grundlagen. So I want to try and unpack that notion a little bit. He says in section 64, the judgment line A is parallel to line B. So he's given us the sortal. The sortal is line, and we mean Euclidean line in the Euclidean plane. Symbol A, two vertical lines B. We can write that line A is parallel to line B. That can be taken as an identity. If we do this, we obtain the concept of direction and say the direction of line A is identical with the direction of line B. So we have a more concrete sortal, line, and a relation among things that fall under that sortal, a relation among lines being parallel. And from that, we're going to introduce a new sortal, directions, with new singular terms that fall under it. To begin with, the direction of line A. So before we did this, we could talk about the line that is the axis of rotation of the Earth's axis. There's the line. But after we've introduced this, we can talk about the direction of that line. And say, for instance, this other line has the same direction as the direction of the Earth's axis, assuming that space is Euclidean, or making adjustments for that. And the criteria of identity and individuation for the new sortal, directions, is determined by the criteria of identity and individuation for the lines, together with the definition in terms of the relation parallel to. And we form that new, more abstract sortal, it's more abstract because we formed it in this way. There are going to be fewer directions than there are lines, because a bunch of lines can share one direction, whereas no two different directions share a line, are directions of the same line. So we're shrinking things. If x is identical to y as a line, if line x is identical to line y, then f of x, direction of line x, is identical to direction to f of y, direction of line y, but it doesn't go the other way around. If fx equals fy, if the direction of a is the same as the direction of b, it doesn't follow that a and b are the same line. So we're sort of shrinking the criteria of the relation between those sortals. We can ask, we ought to be interested in asking, is it Linnaean? Well, no. I mean, it isn't. To be Linnaean, it has to be that all donkeys are mammals, even though not all mammals are donkeys, and no line is the direction of any line. No direction is a line. They're different kinds of things with different criteria of identity, and this is a case where the cross-sortal identities are never true. If we just look at the criteria of identity and individuation, we can see why they aren't. Okay, how does this work? Well, he says the relation among the more concrete objects, the ones you start with, the ones in the old vocabulary that fall under the sortal that we start with line, the relation between those things must have the right properties. It has to be what we'd call an equivalence relation. That is, it has to be reflexive. It must be that for any k, the kind, little a, that A are A. It stands in that relation to itself. It's parallel to itself. Sort of a degenerate special case, but a special case nonetheless. It must be symmetric. It must be that if A is parallel to B, then B is parallel to A. And it must be transitive. If A is parallel to B and B is parallel to C, then A is parallel to C. Why? Because we're going to treat it as an identity, he says. We're going to introduce a new vocabulary in which what's an assertion of an equivalence relation in the old vocabulary has the same or some subset of the inferential role of this new claim, which is an identity governing the use of these new terms, terms falling under the new sortal direction. Since we want to get identities out, identities have to have those properties. If we've got an object, it's identical to itself, and if A is identical to B, then B is identical to A, and equal, if A and C are equal to the same thing, B, then they're equal to each other. Those are structural algebraic properties of identity, but there's a larger class of relations that have those structural properties. Any equivalence relation does. So for instance, parallel lines are not identical lines, but being parallel to is an equivalence relation, reflexive, symmetric, and transitive. What he's saying is, any time you've got an equivalence relation, that's necessary and it's sufficient for you to introduce a new sortal based on derivative from the sortal that applied to the things that can stand in the equivalence relation. You can introduce a new, more abstract sortal and singular terms that fall under it. We know how to identify and individuate them, drawing from the abstractive definition. He says we're going to take or treat what in the old vocabulary is an equivalence relation. In the new vocabulary, the analog of that we're going to treat as an identity relation. What do we mean by that? We mean, well, it's going to license intersubstitution. Right? We're going to be able to say what that the direction of this line is the same as the direction of that line, and in direction talk, we're only going to say things such that if these are the same directions, then everything in direction talk that's true of the one is true of the other. That's part of the rules of the abstraction game. We need to introduce singular terms and sortals. We see those coming together. We have to fix the conceptual content of a recognition judgment. That is, fix the conceptual content of an identity. And we're going to do that in this abstractive way by using what we can already do in the old vocabulary, using the old sortals, and which have, the old sortals are line, so they have their Euclidean criteria of identity and individuation, but we have an equivalence relation on them, and whenever that equivalence relation holds in the old vocabulary, we're going to have a corresponding identity for the new things we're introducing, which will license intersubstitution in the direction vocabulary. And of course, notice that you don't need to just do this once. You can take directions that you introduced by abstraction from lines with respect to parallel, and if you can specify an equivalence relation among directions, then you can abstract with respect to that and build to the sky in more and more abstract sortals and singular terms. Now, one way to see that this is really important is that that's how Frege introduced the notion of begrifflich Inhalt, of conceptual content. So we can individuate the sentences syntactically. Are the sentences the same sequence of letters or not? Sequence is a way of individuating strings, given that you can individuate the characters in them. It's a way of building sortals out of sortals, but we'll syntactically identify the sentences, but we're going to assimilate them in the equivalence relation of intersubstitutable as a premise salva consequentiae. And any two sentences that are intersubstitutable as premises salva consequentiae, such as substituting one for the other uniformly never turns a good implication into a bad one, then we say they have the same conceptual content. That's exactly parallel to the directions, the lines and the directions. He's introducing his semantic concept, which is a sortal kind concept, a content concept. He's introducing it by abstraction. And we'll see that senses and Bedeutungen, every one of Frege's important conceptual semantic concepts is introduced by abstraction. The method of noting inferential invariance under substitution is a method of abstraction, because being intersubstitutable, saving anything, is an equivalence relation. Any expression, sentence, or singular term is intersubstitutable with itself, saving the goodness of implications. If you can intersubstitute B's for A's and A's for B's, then you can the other way around. It's got to be intersubstitution. That's what identities license. And we have the transitive property. If uniformly substituting all B's for all the A's and then C's for all the B's, if each of those steps never turns a good implication into a bad one, then the sequence of those steps doesn't. His method of identifying functions by noting invariance under substitution is a method of abstraction. That's what he introduced along the way of introducing the new notion of content that he's working with. Now here I want to register a caution. It doesn't follow from our introducing directions in this way that it's appropriate to call directions abstract things, abstract objects, or even to say that direction is an abstract sortal kind, an abstract kind of things. We don't get a license to talk about abstract objects or abstracta, or their alternative concrete objects and concreta from this. Frege says about this in 67, if we were to try saying Q is a direction if it's introduced by means of the definition set out above, then we should be treating the way in which the object Q is introduced as a property of Q, which it's not. The definition of an object does not, as such, really assert anything about the object, but only lays down the meaning of a symbol. After this has been done, the definition transforms itself into a judgment, which does assert about the object, but it now no longer introduces the object. It's exactly on a level with other assertions made about it. Quine runs this line that definitions just become ordinary claims about things once you've introduced terms with them. If, moreover, we were to adopt this way out, we should have to be presupposing that an object can only be given in one way. For otherwise, it would not follow from the fact that Q was not introduced by means of our definition that it could not have been introduced by means of it. All identities would then amount simply to this, that whatever is given to us in the same way is to be reckoned as the same. This is a principle so obvious and sterile as not to be worth stating. We could not, in fact, draw from it any conclusion which wasn't the same as one of our premises. Why is it, after all, that we're able to make use of identities with such significant results in such diverse fields? Surely it's because we're able to recognize something as the same again, even though it's given in a different way. Well, this paragraph is one should lay alongside the opening of On Sense and Reference to see where he's coming from there. But the point he's making here is much broader than is clear on the surface of this. He's saying you shouldn't assume that by discriminating things that we get a semantic grip on in different ways. For instance, by an abstractive definition or a Linnaean definition, kittens as young cats, whatever means of introduction we have, you shouldn't assume that the way you introduce the expression, the process or properties in virtue of which we can talk about it, make claims about it, that dividing different ways of introducing terms or sortals, you shouldn't assume that that's introducing different kinds of sortals, different kinds of things. The kinds of the things is one thing, and how we come to be able to talk about them, that's a different thing. The most notorious example of this, of making the move that he's warning us against, in its generalization, is often called the Platonic principle, with 2 capital P's. Looking at Plato saying, look, there are 2 quite fundamentally different ways in which we know about things. By the understanding or the intellect, and by our senses. And the Platonic world is accordingly divided into the realm of being, defined as what is accessible to intellect, as understanding, and the realm of becoming, which we find out about by our senses. Plato's reading the difference in kinds of things, an ontological difference, off of an epistemological difference. Now, I should say, it's not that you can never do that, but you need some auxiliary hypotheses in order to do that. And so if you're going to make a division in your ontology on the basis of a division in your epistemology, or in our case really in the semantics, how is it that we introduce terms that pick these things out, introduced sortal concepts characterizing these kinds of things, which differences in ways of introducing sortals correspond to genuine differences among the kinds of things that we introduce, and which merely reflect differences in our relations to them that may not be essential to the kinds of things that they are. Now, I mentioned this as a cautionary tale. In general, if you find that a move you're making has the shape of applying the Platonic principle, you should step back and ask whether the auxiliary hypotheses you need to actually make that inferential move are in place. And I'm not going to try and say anything generally about what those are. Thinking about sophisticated versions of this, think about the Kripkean necessities that are a posteriori, because they're necessities because of features of how we introduce the terms, but are not, for him, part of the concept that we've introduced in that way. We can introduce an object, say, lucky guy, lucky one, by a definite description, but it doesn't, or we could by a demonstrative, him, that guy, that one, but it doesn't mean that they're demonstrative objects and descriptive objects. Some things can be semantically accessible one way or the other way, but it could be the same things that are. Frege is concerned about the things that can't be demonstrated, can't be introduced that way, but the inference from sort of how the term is legitimately introduced to the kind of thing it is. So why does this matter in the current case? Classical 20th century nominalism is a hostility to abstract objects. We want to try and do without, in our ontology, abstract objects and only have concrete things. Well, what if there's no difference between concrete things and abstract objects? What if abstract object doesn't refer to any? Well, of course, we nominalists say it does. No, even when you say you don't believe in them, it doesn't refer to anything. You're not making a distinction among kinds of things that people have thought there were. Maybe there are. Maybe abstract objects are a distinct kind of kind. But we can't just assume that they are because the way we introduce these new sortals is by abstraction. It doesn't follow from that it couldn't be introduced in some other way. Okay, let's stop there and have a 15-minute break. It's 2:32. Let's come back at 2:47. Okay. I wanted to mention another instance that's philosophically significant where the Platonic principle should be denied. And this was near and dear to the heart of my hero Sellers, so I'm expounding now one of the lessons from the second half of Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. Instrumentalists distinguished observable objects from theoretical objects and were ontologically suspicious or even skeptical about so much as the existence of theoretical objects. Sellers thinks what's really real is what science in the end tells us there is, most of which is theoretical objects. Indeed, his sort of reading of Kant, his reading/rewriting of Kant, sees the noumenal reality as what science, if it lasts long enough, will eventually give us, the theoretical perspective, and all the rest of it, all our empirical observations and so on, that's the appearance to us of it. That's the way he understands things. So he's a realist rather than an instrumentalist about theoretical entities. But he cuts deeper than that. He rejects the distinction between these on the grounds that for him the distinction between observable and theoretical objects is a methodological or epistemological distinction, not an ontological distinction. That is, observational things are things we can find out about by non-inferential reports, exercising our reliable differential responsive dispositions to call things red or square and so on. All those concepts have to be inferentially articulated. They have to have conceptual content in Frege's sense. Theoretical entities, theoretical concepts, are ones that, when they're introduced, the only way you can become entitled to a claim about them is inferentially. So in the stripped-down version, we first postulated the existence of Pluto to explain perturbations in the orbit of Neptune. He said, well, if we do the orbital mechanics right, according to Newton's laws, this wobble in the orbit of Neptune, which we can observe through telescopes of the day would be exactly explained if there were a body in this other orbit, of this mass and so on. So we postulate that there is. That's the best explanation. And then they got a new generation of telescopes and pointed them, this is 1939, pointed the new Mount Palomar telescope, where inferentially we had postulated this purely theoretical entity, inferentially making claims about its mass and position and so on. And there it was. We could observe it. And Sellers says, look, Pluto didn't change. It's not that it was one kind of thing, a purely theoretical object, and changed ontological status when it swam into the ken of Cy Twombly, the astronomer. No, that was a methodological thing. There are things that at a certain point we can only talk about or know about inferentially, but later on they may well become observable, and that's an important methodological change, but it has no direct ontological significance. To think otherwise is to misapply the Platonic principle. So, I think Sellers is just dead right about that case, and it sweeps away, as the result of a confusion, instrumentalism that seeks to make an ontological distinction between what's observable and what's merely theoretical. You can show that it's not ontological by showing how you can change how that boundary is drawn. Frege is sensitive to this issue about introducing new concepts, new sortal kind concepts, like direction, and new singular terms that fall under them, like the direction of the Earth's axis, that's introduced, notice, by definite description. He needs to show that there is such a direction and that there's only one. But if we have a sortal concept, we've already seen, we can introduce singular terms from the concept by restricting the applicability of the sortal concept with attributive properties. We say it's the K such that, and then we give some properties of it. And if we can show that there is a K such that, attributive adjectival properties, and that if A and B are both Ks that satisfy those properties, then A equals B. You can substitute A for B, salva consequentiae. Then you can introduce those terms. So we're introducing a new class of sortal kind concepts by abstraction from old sortals, where the singular terms under the old sortals stand in an equivalence relation. We introduce the new sortals, and we introduce new singular terms by definite description formation from them. He's sensitive that that doesn't mean that we've introduced that the kind of things and those things are of a special kind called abstract kinds relative to the concrete kinds that we started with. At most, even on that dimension, there's sort of relatively more concrete and relatively more abstract relative to a cascade of ever more abstract concepts. But the fact that you've introduced the sortals this way doesn't show that those sortals couldn't be introduced in other ways, that there couldn't be cross-sortal identities of them. Maybe there can, maybe there can't, but the fact that we introduced directions in this way doesn't by itself entail that all the identities of those things with other things are false. So we have two passages. One from 56, I think these are on the handout. We can, of course, by using the last two definitions together, say what's meant by the number 1 plus x belongs to the concept f prime, f double prime, and using this, give the sense of the expression the number 1 plus x belongs to the concept f double prime, belongs to the concept f, sorry, I'm reading the quotation marks, to the concept f, and so on. But we can never, to take a crude example, decide by means of our definitions whether any concept has the number Julius Caesar belonging to it, or whether that same familiar conqueror of Gaul is a number or is not. And then in 66, it will not, for instance, decide for us whether England is the same as the direction of the Earth's axis, if I may be forgiven an example which looks nonsensical. Naturally, no one is going to confuse England with the direction of the Earth's axis, but that's no thanks to our definition of direction that says nothing as to whether the proposition, the direction of A is identical with Q, should be affirmed or denied, except for the one case where Q is given in the form of the direction of B. So we've introduced a function direction of f of A is the direction of the line A, and we've got criteria of identity and individuation that'll tell us whether f of B, of line B, is the same as f of line A. But if the term is not of the form f of x, that is the direction of line such and such, the abstractive definition doesn't say anything about it. It doesn't settle by itself the truth values of any cross-sortal identities. Any identities of things falling under the sortal direction introduced by abstraction, and things that fall under any other sortals. Now, we look at this, well, how bad is this? Well, maybe no cross-sortal identities are true at all, and it's just in the same boat with everything else. No, we see that there are cross-sortal identities. If the sortals are stand in the right relation to each other, that can make sense. Can a sortal that's introduced by abstraction stand in the right relation to any sortal that is not introduced by abstraction, so as to make sense of cross-sortal identities? What we lack, he says, is the concept of a direction. For if we had that, we could lay it down that if Q is not a direction, our proposition is to be denied. Well, if it is a direction, our original definition will decide whether it's to be denied or affirmed. So the temptation is to give as our definition, Q is a direction if, and only if, there's a line B whose direction is Q. But then we've obviously come round in a circle, for in order to make use of this definition, we should have to know already in every case whether the proposition Q is identical with the direction of B was to be affirmed or denied. So, our question is how, against the background of the considerations we've laid out about when some conditions under which cross-sortal identities make sense and some conditions under which they don't. The case of sortals and terms introduced from them by definite descriptions, of new sortals and terms that are introduced by abstraction, isn't like those other cases. It's got features all its own. But what are we to say about these terms? In order to introduce a singular term as the name of an object, we could say, as referring to an object, we have to settle the conceptual content of recognition judgments, judgments expressing our recognition of it as the same again. If you can only refer to it one way, then the identity A equals A is all you get. That's not picking out an object. Now we have some identities involving directions. Some of those identities are sorted into true and false, but only identities of a certain form. Only identities that have f of something on one side and f of something else on the other side. Those are the only ones we've set. But some of those are good, some of those are bad. We've drawn a definite line between those, inheriting those criteria of identity and individuation from the criteria of identity and individuation of the old vocabulary, the relatively more concrete vocabulary, relative to this episode of abstraction. There isn't a good way, he's acknowledging here, of settling the seriously cross-sortal identities, the ones that have a sortal introduced by abstraction on one side of the identity sign, a thing falling under one of those sortals, and a thing falling under, on the other side of the identity, a sortal that was not introduced by abstraction. Nothing in the definition of what introducing things by abstraction, nothing in those definitions will settle that kind of cross-sortal identity. So what are we to say? What are the rules of the game here? Is it good enough to just settle some of the identities, even though you haven't settled whether the direction of the Earth's axis is England, or whether Julius Caesar is identical with any number? Now, Frege ends up taking a hard line on this issue. Not in the Grundlagen. He leaves us with the question. He says, this is how far I've gotten. I haven't talked about numbers yet, but we get them by abstraction. He leaves it open. He doesn't think he knows how to solve it until Grundgesetze, because, as he says in a couple of passages here, as far as he can see, to have specified a definite singular term or sortal concept, you have to settle the truth values of all the identities. You have to have settled when this term is and when it's not intersubstitutable salva consequentiae with every other term. I mean, if the other term is under a different sortal that's different in the right way or the wrong way from the one we've got, then all those are going to be false in the way that the non-Linnaean ones can be known in advance to be false once we think it through. But this is a different mode of concept formation than that. We get a different constellation of singular terms, sortal kind terms, and identity claims. Is it good enough to introduce a singular term? Now, Frege claims, no, we have to settle all of them, particularly to get the rigor he wants in the Grundgesetze. And what he does there does not work. You can see that it doesn't work because, as Russell points out, it leads to an inconsistency. The abstraction principle that he uses there lets you form the sortal concept, in effect, sets that are not members of themselves. And reasoning with that, you can reason to a contradiction from your procedure of abstraction. That, by the way, is in the vast literature on this topic, there's sort of two families of problems with abstraction. The Julius Caesar problem, named after this first passage. I guess they didn't want to call it the England problem because that didn't sounded different. Anyway, yeah, we know about the England problem, but Julius Caesar, we don't really have another problem with him, I think, and so this can be his problem. And the bad company problem, which is that some abstraction principles lead to the inconsistency if by abstraction you introduce new things in this way, you make your old system inconsistent. So, because they're bad abstraction principles, we'd like to be able to draw a line between the good ones and the bad ones. How to do that is the bad company problem. And I linked to a recent article that will give you a sense of that literature on the bad company problem. I'm not going to talk about that now. We'll talk about it a little bit in the Grundgesetze. But as I said earlier, I don't really care about numbers. I don't really care about the consistency of arithmetic. These are all big, important issues, but the triad of sortal kind concepts, singular terms, and identity claims, that's absolutely central in thinking about objects and concepts, that is, in thinking about everything. That's what I'm principally concerned about. I linked to my article called The Significance of Complex Numbers for Frege's Philosophy of Mathematics. Let me just tell you how that comes out, which is Frege's entitled to use the term object and singular term however he likes. I would use object for anything you have a sortal for, but can you have a proper sortal if you haven't settled the truth of all the identities? What I'm looking at there is his project in the Grundgesetze, in the volumes we didn't get to, that is, that he never wrote, of the 3-volume work, to define complex numbers having defined real numbers. He didn't actually finish defining the real numbers, but we can see how it goes. Peter Simons has filled it in, I think, convincingly. But there's a trouble with defining complex numbers from real numbers, and that is the duality of the complex plane. The really shorthand way of putting it is we're going to introduce the imaginary component I as they usually put it, the square root of -1. And we say, which square root of -1? There've got to be two of them. And the answer you'll get is, well, it doesn't matter, pick one. Okay, it doesn't matter, that's true. But how do you pick one? You have to be able to tell them apart. You have to be able to tell I from -I. Not an epistemic question, it's a semantic question. How do you get your term attached to one of them rather than the other? And you can show that there aren't enough resources in the structure of the reals to distinguish them. Well, you can tell that there's two of them, but you can't pick one of them rather than the other. There's a complete duality. They're interchangeable salva consequentiae, which means that you can't settle all the truth of all the identities. Does that mean that complex numbers are defective, not real numbers, not real objects? Well, no, it can't. There is no better behaved object than mathematically than the complex plane. If your requirement for introducing a singular term is okay for reals, but rules the complex numbers out, so much the worse for your criteria of having a genuine singular term, introducing objects. It's fair enough to say that they're not objects in the same sense in which things that we can give a categorical description of are. Okay, these are not singular terms, call them schmingular terms that you use for them. Make the distinction, but what ought to matter to the author of the Begriffsschrift is whether the inferential role of the terms that you've introduced is completely determined. And it is for the numerical representation of complex numbers, a plus bi. We know exactly what follows from that and what doesn't. And one thing that follows is the duality of the plane, that you can systematically swap complex numbers for their complex conjugates. So there's some inferences that wouldn't go through for complex numbers that do for real numbers. But so what? We can say exactly what they are. All that we ought to require of a subsentential expression is that it have a definite conceptual content. That is, that it be settled which intersubstitutions save the goodness of implications and which don't. That we can do. So I argue we should have a relaxed attitude about which identities you need to settle, as long as you settle enough to get a determinate conceptual content that is a determinate inferential role. As long as you can say what the intersubstitution license that you're issuing is, that is, which are that you've determined which are the good identities and which aren't, that's good enough for conceptual contents, even if we say, well, they're not objects in the same sense in which ones where we can settle sort of more of the identities are. So for me, the issue is not, well, how many of the identities do you have to settle? Or is it all of them, or is there some subset of them such that that's good enough to introduce a genuine singular term that picks out an object? That's looking for a bright line around the sets of identities, which Frege is saying, well, the only way he can see to do it is to make it all of them. Well, that's quantifying over all the sortals and sort of an issue there. I'm saying any line that you draw is good enough as long as there's a determinate inferential role, even if it's different from ordinary singular terms in what its inferential role is. After all, there are things that can be true of ordinary middle-sized bits of dry goods, as Austin called sort of rocks and trees and stars and so on. There are things that can be true of them and intersubstitutions of terms for them that don't apply for numbers. That's fine as long as we know exactly which ones are and can be done. Now that's just that's not to answer the Julius Caesar problem, mind you, but it's to say that we ought to consider responses to it that don't require settling the truth values of all of the cross-sortal identity claims. We don't need to be able to recognize those things under all the other guises in which things might occur. Okay, a sort of question I've had a slightly bad conscience about suppressing is why intersubstitutions that we look at? Why not look at substitutions where you can always substitute B for A, but you can't always substitute A for B. You might be tempted to think, well, because all donkeys are mammals, sort of everything that's true of mammals is true of donkeys, so shouldn't you be able to substitute mammal everywhere for donkey? Well, the trouble is you can substitute donkey for mammal as a premise, and the same things will follow. But as a conclusion, you have to substitute mammal for donkey. The moving to the other side of the turnstile flips the inclusion relations. Everything that follows from being a mammal follows from being a donkey, but not everything that's a good reason to take something to be a mammal is a good reason to take it to be a donkey. So the inclusions go differently on the two sides of the turnstile. Here's a deep thought for you to turn over. That's how negation works. That is, all donkeys are mammals, but all non-mammals are non-donkeys. Flip the inclusion. You get the same effect by looking at the conclusory role of donkey and mammal and the premissory role, and that's why in multi-succedent sequent calculi, negation just is the difference between premises and conclusions. The role of not A as a premise can be defined as it's the same as the role of A as a conclusion, and vice versa. That's a deep connection between negation expressing incompatibility and implication. That's a deep connection. Thereon hangs a tale to open that up. Anyway, in my article, What Are Singular Terms and Why Are There Any?, I argue that if you tried to define the roles of singular terms, that is, the things you're substituting for, not by intersubstitutability, but by one-way substitution, you could always substitute B for A, but not A for B, it would preclude your introducing into the language negation or conditionals, either one, precisely because they make explicit this feature of implications that premissory roles and conclusory roles are in a certain sense duals of each other. They're only duals if implication is transitive. There's a whole story to be told there. Yeah, John.
So I was wondering whether there's a tension between the idea that the intentional role of identity is a substitution license and that strongly cross-sortal identities are not true. I mean, I guess I was thinking, suppose Bob Brandom is identical to the next passenger to board the plane. Bob Brandom is also identical to the next person to board the plane. And if we have substitution licenses, we can infer the next passenger to board the plane is the next person to board the plane, which is a strongly cross-sortal identity.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the sticking point is that if me boarding the plane going to New York and me boarding a plane to Pittsburgh are not the same passenger, they're not identical to each other, then they can't be identical to me because things equal to the same thing are equal to each other. And the question is whether we violate, so I mean, that's what's wrong with identifying passengers with persons. You're asking, I take it, yeah, but need that undercut the possibility of our saying, well, but if we're just talking about this passenger here and now, why can't we identify that with a person? And I mean, the question is how you count them. And whether the fact that you count passengers differently than you count people, so that this bad situation, non-triangular situation, can happen where I can't be identical to these two passengers because they're not identical to each other, whether we could restrict the use of identifications of a person with a passenger. Maybe it's the only time I was ever a passenger, to keep the other identity from happening. What's wrong with identifying me with this passenger is that exactly the same justification would identify me with this other passenger, and they're not identical to each other. Here's a well-known example. Sets are introduced by abstraction. Set is a sortal, and sets inherit their criteria of identity and individuation from the criteria of identity and individuation of their elements. Because the rule is that two sets are the same set, just in case they have all the same elements. So we've got to be able to identify and individuate the elements, about which set theory has nothing to say. But we can fully understand the criteria of identity and individuation of sets, at least relative to other sets, in terms of the criteria of identity and individuation of their parts. And there's a temptation then to identify numbers as sets, in the way that there's a temptation to identify directions with the equivalence class of parallel lines. So that we say by the direction of the Earth's axis, I mean the equivalence class of lines parallel to it. Now, Frege was doing this in the Euclidean plane, and one of the troubles is, you could also identify it with the set of lines that are perpendicular to the original line. That set is going to be identified and individuated in just the same way as the directions are. If two lines are parallel, they're going to have the same direction. Which one is it? In the case of numbers, we said, well, we know from piano we just need a sequence of them. We introduced the numbers in pure set theory using the empty set, the set that has no numbers. I'm not going to write it with a special symbol. I'm just going to write it with empty brackets. And we say, well, that's 0. And we'll do that over here too. Now we need a successor to that. Well, we can take the set that has as its only member the empty set as the number 1. Or we could take the set that has you could take the set that has, I probably should have done this the other way around, that has 0 as one element and this other set as the second element. And we'll go on like this. This is the set of the, I guess I don't want that at all. I want the next one to be the same. But the next one is so we go on, it's the set of the prior numbers that is the next number. And either of those is going to work fine, except in this case, over here, it'll be the case that over here it'll be the case that one is an element of 3. And over here, it won't be the case that 1 is an element of 3. These things certainly aren't identical to each other. They have equally good credentials for being the number, so we can't identify the number with either one of those things. Things equal to the same thing have to be equal to each other, identical to each other. Banasaref makes this argument in What Numbers Could Not Be, arguing that no cross-sortal identities that have a number, a numeral on one side, and a set theoretic construction on the other side should be taken to be true. Look, while I'm in the vicinity here, people who have a horror of set theory because of nominalistic concerns about abstract objects, this is the kind of construction, it's pure set theory that they object to. The idea that just by forming sets sort of from nothing, you can get new things, that there's a difference between the unit set and the element that is its unit, and they like mereology, that also forms new sortals, wholes, from old sortals. The rule is that two mereological wholes are identical just in case they have the same parts. So you've got to have a sortal for the parts, and then you can form the mereological whole from it. Well, wait a minute, I thought that was the same rule as for sets. Well, it is. It only differs in what happens when you repeat that. And in set theory, you say, well, if I now form the set from this set, it just has one member, namely the set. Whereas if you form a whole from a whole, you just get the original whole. You don't get anything new from it. So that seems sort of more concrete. I mean, in mereology, you have a null element too. You need it in order for the mereological constellation to be a lattice. You've got to have a bottom for it. So you postulate this null part, which by courtesy is considered a part of every whole. So it's like the empty set, except with the empty set, you can now form its unit set. So you have not started off with any sortal at all in that case. You get pure set theory by doing that. But if you take the whole whose only part is the null part, you just get the null part. You don't get anything more. And if you add the null part to, well, it's already in everything, so you just get the same whole that you had before. So you don't get the exotic aviary of pure set theory. But these are just different abstraction principles. In each case, you're inheriting the individuation from the sortals of the elements. And what's peculiar, is it fishy, about pure set theory is you don't start off with any terms or sortals. They say, well, the empty set is the same no matter what the sortal under which the things that aren't in it falls. Well, is that a way of avoiding the ontological question of criteria of identity and individuation for things? And you say, we'll do just with the criteria of identity and individuation of set theory. We don't need to start with anything because it doesn't matter what sortal the things that aren't in it fall under. Well, really? It doesn't matter at all. You can identify and individuate to the sky. I mean, I'm not saying that set theory is sort of broken backed, but if we're talking about sort of what kinds of objects there are, that's a big difference to, and that isn't sort of the ontological worry that nominalists have because of a taste for desert landscapes, as Quine says. It's a different sort of difficulty. Okay, I need to say something about numbers. For numbers, the equivalence relation is one-to-one correspondence between things falling under the sortal. Two sortals have the same number if you can put the things that fall under them into a one-to-one correspondence. That's reflexive, it's symmetric, and it's transitive. Number is what you get if you abstract from it. Frege shows it's easy to define, well, 0 is the number of things that fall under a self-contradictory concept, something nothing can fall under. Perfectly good concept, he was arguing, but nothing falls under it. Second natural satellite of Earth, nothing falls under that either. It has the number 0 to it. So in 69, he says, my definition of number is as follows. The number which belongs to the concept F, the sortal kind concept F, is the extension of the concept equal to the concept F. And then in a footnote, his footnote ends, I assume it's known what the extension of a concept is. That's a pretty jaw-dropping claim to make for the guy who was so fussy about everybody else's definitions on the way to number. You know, if Dedekind had said, I assume it's known what a unit is, and then after that, everything is okay. Frege would have been, well, was all over him for that. He not only says, well, I'm not going to tell you what the extension of a concept is, I assume that. He does that in a footnote, as though nothing to see here, folks, no worries here. Defining explicitly extensions of concepts, his term is courses of value, Wertverlauf. That's what he does in the Grundgesetze, and that's when he gets in trouble. It's very difficult, very dangerous to define the extension of a concept. It's not just that some of them don't have any, that's okay. It's not, inconsistent concepts aren't a problem, but your notion of the extension of a concept can cause an inconsistency in your theory. Okay, I wanted to say a couple of other things in the vicinity of numbers, one of which interacts with the claim about even countable being a pseudo-sortal like object and property, object in particular. When I was a graduate student, a student of David Lewis, and he brought in a visitor, the Czech logician Pavel Tiki. And Tiki's view at that point was there's only a finite number of things in our world or in any world. And indeed, there is some finite number n, such that it's a necessary truth that every world has exactly n things in it. Now, this is a cockamamie view. But Lewis didn't care about that at all. He said, let's see what follows, if we said that. What would things look like? But first, let me ask you, he says to Pavel, so this is the only constraint on trans-world identification. Yes, Pavel says, there is a world in which you are a hard-boiled egg. There's no preservation of sortals necessary identifying it. There is no world in which you, David Lewis, are two hard-boiled eggs. That's the constraint. And Lewis says, double-yolked egg? Could I get a double-yolked egg? Okay. I thought, gee, you guys both think you can count things. You both think that you could look at a possible world and there's a fact to the matter about how many things there are in it. Under what sortals are you counting these things of which you speak? Because they're counting them. That's the essential feature of this. Are there an infinite number of things in a possible world? Is it intelligible to have a possible world with only one thing in it? Well, no, you haven't specified a possibility yet. I don't care whether there could be a world with only one donkey in it. Well, no, there couldn't, because it couldn't have the counterfeit subjunctive properties and so on. But that's a sort of metaphysics. But you think that you can count these things. Okay, that's one cautionary tale. If you're not keeping this Fregean lesson about the triangle of sortal kind concepts, singular terms, and identity claims, which we see there's issues about all three of them and how they're related, but you need all three of them. Second thing I want to say, and this is a much more sophisticated, but I still think mistake. So one of the problems with standard modal logic is you can't do semantics for mathematical claims in it because they're all necessarily true. If they're true at all, if you represent the content of a proposition by the set of possible worlds in which it's true, all arithmetic claims have the same content, so it's just not helpful to think semantically about them. Italian modal logician Aldo Brisson wrote a book with a different account of numbers. He says, the number 3 is different from one possible world to another. Because by the number 3, I mean what Frege meant, roughly. It's something like the equivalence class of all the triples in that world. So in this world, suppose there's 3 stooges. I think there were actually 4, but suppose there were just 3. But there's some other world that has 12 stooges in it. Then the 3 stooges would be part of the number 3 in this world, and the 12 stooges would not be part, even if it included the same guys, would not be part of the number 3 in the other world. And what we're doing is looking at necessary relations among, the 3 and the 4. No matter what they are in any world, together the sum of them is 7. And I can explain this. So he had a much richer notion of number in this intentional semantic context, and could do semantic things in mathematics that you can't do in standard possible world semantics. But there's got to be a fact to the matter about what all the triples are. That's all the sets of 3 things. Where are the sortals? Whether something counts as in that depends on what the sortals are, and that was not represented in his modal logic. So even though that's a much more sophisticated view than the assumption that Tiki was making, it's still wrong. Okay, this issue now about Julius Caesar, the cross-sortal identities that involve expressions introduced by abstraction, this is really important because all these terms are introduced, all these semantic terms, in particular conceptual content, but senses, reference, Bedeutungen, objects, the things referred to under whatever sortal, we still understand those in terms of abstraction. So this problem, this issue, is going to be with us from here on out. This peculiar new way of introducing new sortals from old sortals by abstraction. And Frege's thought was, you get all of mathematics this way. And in a sense, you do. The first sort of generalization is to isomorphisms of structured things. So if you've got not just objects that we can put in one-to-one correspondence, but objects that have an ordering on them. We've got this ordering and this other ordering. Well, an equivalence relation between them that's order preserving, a mapping of the objects of the one onto the other that's order preserving, can be an isomorphism. And that's an equivalence relation. So you can abstract on it and talk about, in effect, what these partial orderings have in common. And something Frege was, he knew the mathematics for this, but it's been very late for us to understand it. Maybe we needed category theory to do it, but with these ordered structures, you don't really need an isomorphism. It's enough if you've got order-preserving mappings that go from structure A to structure B, and another mapping that goes from B to A. They can be a Galois connection. They can be such that if f of some element of A is greater than element B, then G of B is going to be greater than A. You can build an isomorphism from that, but you can also just work with the two relations. And it turns out that's the one that's important in algebra. Category theory is thinking about generalizations of equivalence relations that give you abstraction-like features. To a first approximation, that is the way people think about contemporary mathematics. One of the hot areas is homotopy type theory, which self-consciously thinks of itself as general in terms of generalizations of identity. How can you relax the conditions that started off being requiring an equivalence relation? How can you relax those sort of in structural hierarchies, different ways of relaxing them? The Galois connection I was talking about is sort of an example in a different dimension. And homotopy type theory is thinking about the relation between different ways of relaxing the requirement that you use to introduce things that are like identities that let you go back and forth. So what Frege has put his finger on here is the key idea behind modern mathematics. So thinking about what's sort of how this new way of introducing new sortals from old works, we can happily stay at the level of equivalence relations and identity, but it's really resonant in understanding a lot of contemporary math and so science. So as I say, the Julius Caesar problem is going to stay with us now. What we're reading for next week is Frege thinking hard about the notion of function, which is an abstractive notion. His notion of function involves noting invariance under substitution of arguments. So, those problems are going to be in play for everything that he's talking about. He sees a different issue with it, but not fully unrelated. Okay, well, be well. See you next week.
Thank you.